Today, my special guest is Karen McMahon. She's a certified relationship and divorce coach, and she has a website called journeybeyonddivorce.com. Now, today we're talking about how to find compassion and peace and fulfillment if you're in a high conflict relationship, how to determine whether it's a high conflict or it's just a regular relationship, and what to do about that. So enjoy. Okay. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast for this week. This week, I have the amazing Karen McMahon with me. Hi, Karen. How are you, darling?
Hi, Natalie. How are you?
Now, Karen is a certified relationship and divorce coach, and she actually has a whole team of people working with her as well. And so today, what we want to focus on, what we're going to be talking about, is how you can live a life with compassion and peace and joy, despite the fact that your relationship and the world around you may be going crazy. All hell may be breaking loose, but we want to talk about how you can navigate that with peace and compassion. So what I wanted to talk to you about, I know initially we're just talking about this before we started recording, is how, as we go through divorce and we go through separation and parting from our partners, that we get stuck in this idea that, what we're going through is common and that everyone goes through that. And that's just the normal thing. But that's not necessarily the case, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different ways that a relationship starts going sour. And so if you're in that crazy making way, you don't necessarily, you can't really tell how within the norm or not you are. That's what I find.
Yeah. So why don't we start with talking about someone who may be listening to the podcast who's in a place where there's conflict in their marriage or in their union. So how do we handle it? Like, is there a way that we can, because, the more, I know with my partner and I, not that we fight very often, but when we do, my mind starts to spiral into, wow, is this meant to happen? We shouldn't be fighting. Like, is this meant to be? So you kind of go into that spiral. So what's the difference between having an argument, say, or disagreement, and thinking, okay, it's time for me to get out?
Right. And so that's such a great place to start, Natalie, because in a standard relationship, in a relationship where two people have been together for a while, it's going to make sense. We're two adults under one roof. There's going to be differences. And what comes into play even in that relationship, though, is if one person is conflict avoidant, or if both people have different experiences with disagreeing, what could just be a disagreement could feel like this very big, intimidating conflict, or can turn into that conflict based on the two individuals and their background. And so I work with a lot of people who are conflict avoidant, and what they end up doing is swallowing and saying yes and going along and playing small and shutting down and shutting up until they're so at the edge that they blow up, and they seem very high conflict, and they're not comfortable in conflict, but they've put themselves between such a rock and a hard place. It's all that's left. It's like the kettle that hasn't had any ability to let the steam out, and then the whole pot blows up.
Right.
That can happen in even a standard relationship. And if that is you, the listener, then I want to talk about what you can do about that. And if I could just touch on that before I go to high conflict, which is kind of that happening on a very regular basis for maybe a lot of different reasons. But for the individuals who we're great until we disagree, and then we go off the rails, it's really important. My favorite saying is every upset is a setup. Every time I get upset or triggered, what's so easy is to look across the room and go, well, it's Natalie's fault.
Right.
But the truth is, if I get quiet with myself, my trigger, my button, my tender underbelly predated my relationship with Natalie. And so when I can go there and go, well, what is it? And it might be my fear of conflict because mom and dad used to fight, or one of my parents had such a hostile way of dealing with parenting. Whatever is going on, that's what's coming up. And so I'm being triggered. And so for your listeners who are in what seem like healthy relationships, except for when there's disagreement, when you can slow it down, understand what just happened. Did I feel disrespected? Did an insecurity come up? Did a judgment come up? Like, what happened with me? I'm not asking what happened with Natalie on the other side of the room. What happened with me? And when you can begin to go, oh, okay, you know what? I have a disrespect button. It makes sense. It dates all the way back to ABC. Now you can go to your partner and say, look, can we talk about what happened? I realized I felt really disrespected for these reasons. I'm not saying you, I'm not saying what Natalie did. I'm saying what I felt, what my perspective was. Can we talk this through? Right. Then out of a disagreement and the reactivity, something beautiful can grow. And in a healthy relationship, the other party is going to want to hear you. They're going to want to see you. I didn't realize that that's not what I meant to do. Let me tell you what I did mean for you to hear. Do you understand now? And there's this lovely joining and mending that happens.
Yeah.
This is not what happens when you're in an unhealthy, I'll call it toxic or high conflict relationship. The experience doesn't go so lovely. It goes rather sideways, actually quite down the toilet most of the time.
Right. Yeah, because what I've heard a saying that with couples, it's not how they love, it's how they fight. And you can tell how, because if you can get to that place, because, often you'll, because I know in my previous marriage, I used to avoid conflict and just be quiet, until I become so indifferent that I didn't care anymore.
Right.
It's like I can't. It was like a canyon of things I never got to say, and so I just checked out, kind of thing, which I don't want to do in this relationship because I really want to speak up for myself. So I find that we are definitely getting to that place where our disagreements are not major or anything, but you can be in a place where when your emotions are involved, that all you're doing is having two people are talking, defending their position,
and nobody
and not hearing the other person.
That's right. Yeah. And in fact, one of my favorite books is, so I have it easily available, is Getting the Love You Want. I'm not going to try and find it right now. And it's by Harville Hendrix and Helen Hunt. They're a couple, they're in their 70s, and they are the founders of Imago Therapy. And I'm not a therapist, but I often use it in my couples coaching because what they explain is two things: that it's not about the topic. So whether you're fighting over sex or money or the vacation or the kids or whatever, it's never about that. The struggle is in the context, not the content. The context is, how do we communicate when triggered, when upset, when disagreeing? So it doesn't matter if I'm fighting with you, Natalie, about money or something else. The way I handle myself in conflict or disagreement and the way you do is what we want to look at. And so with couples, I've got a couple of couples I'm working with right now. One of them brought a very sensitive topic to the table. And as I was listening in that very first session, there was something else going on. There was a contextual thing where one wasn't feeling heard by the other, where one wasn't inviting the other into active participation in couple decisions. And so what we do is we find that if we can fix the context, if people can hear and listen and even mirror back what they've heard and then respond, because what happens is, just like you and I have a headset on, we all have a filter, and my filter is going to be a filter of being hurt and offended that you disrespected me. So I'm not actually going to hear what you're saying. I'm going to hear through the judgment of you being a disrespectful son of a gun. And so I'm not going to hear what's real. So now we're having a fight and we're not even speaking the same language. When couples can get on the same page and really slow it down enough to hear each other, then they can have a soft heart for each other, because we're all just a bunch of wounded children coming to the table trying to make things work.
Right.
And then you can hold the space for your partner to go and work on their stuff while you work on your stuff. That's healthy. That's where it really grows stronger and stronger and stronger together, which is what we hope for. And then the dysfunctional, the high conflict, just, they never get to experience that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So when we're saying high conflict, are we talking about both partners being, or just one? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so, my experience is that there's often a disordered individual, and that could be because of trauma, it could be because of a mental health issue, it could be because of an addiction or alcoholism. Like, there's a lot of different things that causes someone to be, and I can give a couple of examples. Black and white is one of the things. So someone who's rigid, right? They're not really open, they're not flexible to hear and understand. It may also be that it's very hard for them to see their part in anything. And so it's always your fault. It's just like, it's you, I'm going to blame you, I'm going to accuse you. If you even point out why it's me, I'll tell you why. Well, maybe I did do that, but you made me do it. Like, that kind of an individual. And the other thing that a lot of times you deal with in high conflict relationships is a real lack of empathy from one person. And then the other person's just screaming and yelling and begging to be seen and felt and heard. Both parties typically appear high conflict. Right. I was the partner of someone with a personality disorder. I was a frothing at the mouth, out of my mind rageaholic. I didn't know what his situation was. I just knew that trying to negotiate with insanity over and over, week after week, month after month, year after year, had made me crazy. Period. End of story. And I looked equally as high conflict as he did, because I had no understanding of what I was dealing with. And so I was trying to control it, to change it, to control it. And as a result, I look like a loony. I look like a frothing at the mouth, raging woman. In fact, for me, I woke up one morning and I looked in the mirror, and my mom, I always said my mom was a rageaholic, and for good reason. She had her own challenges. I looked in the mirror and I saw my mom, and I was like, I hate myself. And I called a therapist the very next day and I said, I am so lost. I am so incredibly lost that I don't even know where to begin. And that's often what the partner in a high conflict marriage feels like. And sometimes they don't have those words. They're not actually that far along yet, but there's such a sense of, what in the world?
Jerry Robin.
Why can't I get my control of my life? Why can't I figure this piece out? And so that might resonate with some of your listeners.
Right. So when we find ourselves in a situation like this, how do we get to a place of peace and compassion? Like, that sounds like it's a really hard road to walk down.
Well, one of the reasons we call the company Journey Beyond Divorce is because with everything, it's a journey, it's a process. And so I would like to chat a little bit about our emotional energy, because I think that will give your listeners such a crystal clear idea of the different levels of emotional energy that we live in and how we can heal and regulate ourselves and detach from the insanity, from the chaos of the other person, even while staying in relationship, and staying under the same roof. And so what I say to people when they ask, well, should we mend or should we end?
Right.
Is if you're not in physical harm, stay and work on mending, because even if you don't mend the relationship at all, the work you do on yourself is going to be a game changer. And that's what I'd like to talk about right now. So when I was in my high conflict marriage, I mean, I was madly in love with this guy, you know, handsome, charismatic, owned business. And then as two babies came into it, everything started changing. And he couldn't be the center of all of my attention anymore and what have you. And what I saw was myself go from this high emotional energy of like joy and peace, plummeting down into the lowest emotional energy that we experience is when we feel like a victim. When we feel like a victim, we're helpless, we're hopeless. If you've been in that position, you know, there are days where you don't even want to climb out of the bed. You don't even want to get out from underneath the covers. So that's like the lowest. We feel like we have almost like a damp, moldy blanket over us, right? It's just so yucky. And one step up from that is conflict, what we're talking about. Conflict has a little bit more energy. You dukes up, you're ready to fight or go hide in your cave, either one, but it's got a little bit more energy than helpless, hopeless. But both of those are what we call catabolic. They're life depleting. And we feel it when we feel that way. We feel like the life's been sucked out of me. I got nothing to give. I must be standing next to a black hole, right? And I want your listeners to consider that those two, feeling like a victim or feeling like you're in a lot of conflict, that you're in the dungeon and the basement.
Right.
And if you think about a dungeon or a sub-basement and a basement, what perspective do you have? And this is where we're going to get into thoughts, right? The perspective that you have is a little casement window, or if you're in a dungeon, maybe it's just a little peep circle. And so imagine looking at the world through a straw. How much do you see?
Yeah,
not a whole lot.
Yeah.
And for those of you who live in places where, you know, I'm from New York, so we would have these like 2 foot wide by 1 foot tall casement windows in our basement. So you see people's feet. So all I can see is your feet. What kind of a perspective do I have? None. And it's the same thing emotionally. If I'm in victim or conflict energy and I'm trying to solve a problem, I have no perspective. First of all, I'm totally in my amygdala, in my reptilian brain. I have no access to my frontal cortex where all of my logical thinking happens. So I'm flooded with cortisol. I have no perspective. I can't even come up with options and choices and decisions because I'm so low down. So the question is, how do you go from being there, which is where everybody in a high conflict or toxic relationship is, to levitating, or I want to say using an emotional elevator to move up? And so the step above conflict is forgiveness. Forgiveness is the gateway. And you may think there is no bloody way I'm forgiving him or her. And so we start with detachment. Detach. How can you detach? How can you stop taking your partner or spouse who's high conflict so personally? It feels personal, but here's the thing. Whether it was you or Jane Doe or Mary Smith or someone else, they would be behaving the same. It's actually not about you. They will tell you it's totally your fault and it's totally about you. But if you could step back and go, well, does that person have what's their best relationship? I remember once saying, well, what's my then husband's best relationship? And I was like, wow, his closest relationships were all 6 months old or newer.
Right.
And that really helped me realize, like, this is not about me. This is an individual who has a really hard time being in a relationship. It's very displeasing to be in relationship with him. So that's getting to forgiveness. Can I forgive myself for fighting? And then here's the harder part, and it's a journey, so try not to shut down when I say this. But can you think about, how can I even take a baby step toward forgiving that person? That person, I mean, I was called the most horrible names. I needed to take a hot shower after some of our arguments. The way I came to find forgiveness, and in teeny little baby steps in the beginning, now I completely forgive and I have compassion. And that's me going further up that emotional elevator. But forgiveness is, if you know that the person has disorder, if you know that your partner or spouse comes from a dysfunctional family, his dad is a wingnut, his mom is like cold, whatever it is, if you understand what they came from, it's not accepting bad behavior. It's simply softening your heart for the fact that this is a human being with wounds and shortcomings. I may not want to stay in relationship with him or her, but can I find any path to forgiveness? Now, if you're a codependent and a people pleaser and you're bending over backwards and giving yourself away, that's not the time to find forgiveness. Then you want to kind of stay in conflict until you can create some space. But when you find forgiveness, and then what comes after forgiveness, the next level up is compassion.
Right.
I have compassion now. I can say now, many years later, I have incredible compassion for my ex-husband. He's had an enormously difficult time finding love. He's had a hard time in his relationships with family members, children, old friends. And so I can be I get to live my life. Now, if you're in a relationship, but what you do is you begin detaching, forgiving yourself, finding forgiveness. And what happens as you're working on yourself, and let's say you're becoming less reactive, right? Because you're noticing your triggers and you're waiting and calming down. And then even if the other person isn't willing to have a calm conversation, you're feeling more empowered because you're in control of yourself. I'm not blowing up. I'm not saying things I regret. I'm not behaving in ways that I feel guilty or shameful about. And the other thing that's going to happen, Natalie, is you're going to become crystal clear. As I get better, he or she is not moving toward me to do a nicer dance.
Right.
They're actually moving away, or they're getting more hostile. And so for people who aren't sure if they should mend or end, when you stay and you start working on yourself, that certainty, that clarity kind of comes around on its own.
Right.
And you begin to go from forgiveness to compassion. And then once you're there, the peace and joy is about me, right? Like if we think about it, yeah, we would all love to be in a beautiful, hot romantic relationship. But if you've been in a high conflict relationship and you can get to a place where I like myself more than I did, I feel more empowered and in control of myself. Oh, look at that. I'm going to start stretching and spending a little bit more time with my girlfriends or my guy friends. I'm going to do activities that bring me joy. While in that relationship, you will see your compassion, peace, and joy rise. And as you become more regulated, more able to control your own ways, there's a sense of self-esteem and self-confidence and joy that comes with that. Yeah. Does that make sense? Does that resonate?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think what it also does is that, if you are in the query of, do I want to mend this? You feel confident that you've done everything that you can. It's not like you go, okay, well, I opted out and, maybe I should have stayed, and you have that, that regret or whatever. You go, no, I did everything that I could. And I did it from a place of compassion. So, I agree with you totally. The detachment, it is important for us at any time that we're in conflict, because when we are emotionally triggered and reactive, we not only can we not hear, but we can't articulate ourselves very well because we're all flooded with cortisol, and then just, stuff comes out that we have no control over. But to be able to take a moment and take a breath, and to be able to just detach for a moment, to give yourself the opportunity to make a choice on how you want to respond in the moment, I think is super important.
And it's actually the first step. I mean, the first step is always awareness. And so what you just described so beautifully is you step into awareness. I'm aware that I'm triggered, that I'm out of control, that I'm, about to say and do things that I'm probably going to regret. And in that moment, in 12-step programs, they say, if you're upset, count to 10. If you're really upset, count to 100. It doesn't take long for that. Eckhart Tolle calls it the pain body. You feel it. You feel the flush come up. Your face could even get red. You feel that heat. But it subsides. Like within a minute, it subsides. And so when you can take the break, have that pause, that can be a game changer in terms of how you present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I suppose the next logical question is, let's say that you do decide to leave the relationship. I mean, it's not like you leave instantly and then, everything's great. I mean, there is, especially if there's children involved, there is still ongoing, relationship that needs to happen there. What are some tips that we could use if we're in that situation?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I'm going to say, because I think that this is the thing that like everybody gets wrong, stop trying to change him or her. You're leaving.
Yeah.
You weren't able to do it during the marriage or the relationship. You certainly aren't doing it now. So the biggest thing I see is individuals who are either in the process of divorce or post-divorce, who are having the exact same fights, the exact same frustration. It's like you have this divorce decree, this piece of paper, which is worth jack, because you're as miserable as you were when you were married to him or her. You're just under a separate roof. And the people who feel so liberated and free are the ones who say, okay, Natalie's Natalie. I know what her strengths are. I know where she triggers me. I know where we do a dance well and where we don't dance so well. And I'm not going to try and change her. I am going to stay on my side of the street. It's another 12-step saying, keep your side of the street clean. Don't go over on his or her side of the street. And I'm going to decide how I'm going to be. And when it comes to parenting, I think there's such a huge, beautiful, understandable narrative out there, which is, if you're a good parent, you're going to be an amicable co-parent.
Right.
Well, that just goes all out the window with high conflict. You're not going to have an amicable co-parenting relationship. How goes the marriage, so goes the divorce. How goes the divorce, so goes the co-parenting.
Right.
The way it will be amicable is by you working on yourself, noticing your triggers, and when things happen, whatever you do not call up your ex and tell them why they should be different. You just go to the nearest wall and bash your head on it, and that would be more effective. What you want to do is you want to go to your children, and even school-age children, and you want to start not complaining about mom or dad. No, not at all. But you want to start talking about the things that might be happening when they're not with you that you're concerned about and why. And so I co-parented for about 15 years with a very high conflict ex. And a lot of things that came up involved me talking to the children. And one of my best examples is when the kids were teenagers, dad was very opposed to drinking, and the household was open to pot smoking for anybody who wanted to come. I had no control over this.
Right.
And my kids were pretty happy with this rule. This was not something that they were complaining about. And so all I could do was sit with them, talk about the rules under my house, under my roof, what my concerns were, My dad was an alcoholic, and so I was able to explain to them, like, your dad smokes, my dad was an alcoholic. This is a slippery slope for you. Like, addiction is right around the corner. So let's talk this through. And at the same time, when dad would be hurtful toward one of them, it wouldn't be like, oh, isn't dad such a piece of garbage? It was more, what did you experience? What did you do? What would you like to have done? How can I support you? What would you do different the next time? What do you need? And all of this. And when we do that with our children, and yes, from grade school on up, what you're doing is you're breaking the pattern of fighting with your ex, and you're actually raising your children's emotional intelligence and the trust between you and them, because you're building more adult dialogue. You're not telling. Parents tell all the time, Natalie. 2 ears, 1 mouth. They tell instead of asking. And so when you start asking your child and letting them engage in the conversation, you're staying away from the conflict, and you're building this really amazing young person with some self-awareness and understanding. And you also, as the parent, have a much better sense of where are they at with this,
Right.
and what do I need to watch out for? I think especially with teenagers, parents say, so many parents tell me, I just don't know. It's more scary because they just and they don't talk to me, and I have no idea. And this kind of a dialogue builds the communication in your relationship to a whole different level.
Right. This is such great advice. Now, I know that you have a gift for our listeners. And for those of you who are listening, you'll be able to find the link for this in the show notes. So we were talking about this before we got on air, about this gift that you wanted to share with everyone.
Yes. So we have an assessment. It's a 10 toxic tells assessment. And so it's how toxic is your relationship is the name of it. And so you can go to journeybeyonddivorce.com, and right on the homepage, you'll see a place where you can download this assessment, and it'll really help you. There's only 10 questions, and it'll really help you understand the level of toxicity of your relationship. And then it also talks about the very first tool and skill that you need to begin to move out of this unhealthy dynamic. And so they can get that at the website, journeybeyonddivorce.com.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Karen. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. And thank you for everything that you do to help people navigate through one of the most traumatic and difficult things that a lot of us face. I mean, divorce rates are very high. And after going through my own, I'm thinking, I don't know whether we're meant to be married for someone our entire lives, because we're completely different at this age than we were when we were in our 20s and 30s. So, and some of us are blessed to have a great experience, and some of us aren't. So thank you for everything that you're doing to help those that are challenged.
Thank you so much.